Okay, so I know what you're thinking now. Why in the world would I ever use every or some? My answer to that is all the darn time. You will use these all the darn time if you look for places to make use of them. So let's look at a practical example of this. Let's imagine for a moment that we are building a login or a sign-up form for an application. So a login form should probably have like a username and a password input. Now when the user submits the form, and when they actually click, okay, log me in or sign me up or whatever that button might say, before we actually submit that form to the server and try to sign the user in or sign them up or whatever it might be, chances are we're going to want to validate the inputs and make sure that the user actually types something in. We want to make sure that they actually put something in, and if they did not, then perhaps we need to say, show an error message to the user or deny them the ability to log in or whatever it might be. Basically, we just want to make sure they put in some information. So let's draft up some code that might help us with this validation. First, I'm going to make a field class. And, I use the term class very loosely here. So this class might have this dot value equal to value, and then I could use this by doing something like var username is new field, and I would give it my username, which in my case would be something like too cool or something. No, I'm kidding, of course. And the password of new field and my password. And so this object here, field, is just an object that represents a field on my form. So literally like a text input or something like that. And so I could have many different types of fields. I could have a username field and a password field, or maybe a birth date field, or a whatever confirmation code field, whatever type of field I might have. And so remember the problem that we're trying to solve here is how can we easily validate this form? So I'm going to add a method to field. If you're not familiar with prototypes, do not sweat it. We're going to talk about prototypes in great detail later on in this course. For right now, let's just stick with our code. And from this validate function that I just added, I'm going to return this .value.length greater than 0. So we're saying a field is valid if it has a length greater than 0. So if I do username validate now, okay, cool. My username has some actual characters here, so my username is valid. If I removed all the characters, then all of a sudden it goes to being false. Just to be really clear here, these inputs of like too cool and my password, the thought here, the step that I'm kind of skipping because we're just writing JavaScript code and not actual HTML here, is these inputs right here, or these strings, would really come off the field itself. So like when a user types something in, they might type in a username of too cool, and then we would create a new field object with it and use that object to validate the input. Okay, that's the thought process there. So now we've got our username and password, and we want to make sure that every every field on our form is valid. So we could do something like password.validate as well. So if our username is valid and our password is valid, then great, let's sign our user up. But what would happen over time if we started getting a bunch of other fields on here as well, like say birth date, and this was 10/10/2010 or whatever it might be, right? I might have many other fields coming into my form over time, and I wouldn't have to do something really tedious like adding on and birthdate.validate and today's date validate and all these other fields that we might add onto the form over time. So this would be a fantastic location to refactor into making use of the every helper. Instead of listing out all these different fields and saying .validate, .validate, .validate. Instead, I might just do something like var fields is my username, password, and birthdate fields. Let's get some new lines. And then to validate all the fields in one go, I could just run fields every, here's my individual field, and I'll return field.validate. And now with this single line right here, I could say go through, validate all my fields, and tell me if they're all valid. So now, with the result of this, I could assign this to something like form is valid. And then later on down the code, if form is valid, let's get some new lines again. Allow user to submit, else show an error message. So basically show them an error message if they did something wrong here. Otherwise, go ahead and allow them to submit. And so this is all made possible by using the every helper right here. It's what avoided or kept us from having to do something like username.valid and password.valid and birthdate.valid and so on and so on and so on again and again and again. With just our every helper right here, we condensed it down to dramatically less logic. Okay, so this would be a very practical use of the every helper. Great, so let's continue on to the next section and start working on some exercises around every and sum. I'll see you there.